I never thought my peaceful suburban life would turn into a nightmare because of my golden retriever and a vindictive neighbor. But here we are. Let me paint you a picture of how this all started. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October when I first noticed something was seriously wrong. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my robe, watching the sunrise filter through the maple trees in our backyard. Our house sits on Elmwood Drive in a quiet neighborhood where most of us have lived for years. You know, the kind of place where people wave from their driveways and kids still ride bikes without supervision. That's when I heard it. The sharp, rhythmic sound of metal clanging against metal, followed immediately by my dog Max's frantic barking. Max is usually the most well-behaved golden retriever you'd ever meet. 7 years old, gentle with children, the type of dog who greets everyone with his tail wagging. But something was setting him off every single morning at exactly 6:47 a.m. Before we dive into this unbelievable tale, please like and subscribe. I read every comment, so tell me where you're from. My name is Patricia Bell. I'm 48 years old, and I've been living in this house with my family for 12 years. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I'm home most days, so I know the rhythms of our neighborhood better than most. I know when Mrs. Henderson walks her poodle, when the mail truck makes its rounds, and when the school buses rumble past. This new disturbance didn't fit any normal pattern. I walked to our back window and peered through the blinds toward the house behind ours. That's where Victoria Marsh lives. She moved in about 8 months ago after the elderly couple who used to live there moved to assisted living. Victoria is probably in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed even when she's just checking her mailbox, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of manicured lawn that makes the rest of us look like we're not trying hard enough. From day one, Victoria made it clear she had very specific ideas about how a neighborhood should operate. She introduced herself by walking door to door with a typed list of community standards she felt we should all follow. Things like specific hours for lawn mowing, guidelines for holiday decorations, and yes, strict noise ordinances that went far beyond what our city actually required. The clanging sound came again, and Max erupted into another round of barking. That's when I saw her. Victoria was standing at the fence line between our properties, rhythmically banging what looked like a metal spoon against her fence post. The moment Max started barking, she stopped and retreated into her house, but not before I caught her glancing toward our back door with what I can only describe as a satisfied smirk. "Mom, can you please get Max to stop barking?" I turned to see my son David shuffling into the kitchen, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles, wearing the oversized t-shirt he'd slept in. David Bell is 22, fresh out of college and living back home while he figures out his next steps. A situation that's becoming more common, but still feels surreal to me. He inherited his father's tall frame and my stubborn streak, which makes for interesting family dynamics. "I'm trying to figure out what's setting him off," I said, still watching Victoria's backyard. This is the third morning in a row. David poured himself a cup of coffee and joined me at the window. "Maybe he's just getting old and cranky? Doesn't that happen to dogs?" "Max isn't old, and he's definitely not cranky," I replied, feeling oddly defensive of our family pet. "Something is deliberately disturbing him." As if on cue, the metallic clanging started again. This time, I was ready with my phone, recording through the window as Victoria emerged from behind her garden shed with what appeared to be a large serving spoon and began striking her side of our shared fence. The moment Max's barking echoed across both yards, she stopped and hurried back inside. "Did you just see that?" I asked David, replaying the video. He leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the small screen. "It kind of looks like she's doing it on purpose, but why would anyone want to make a dog bark?" That question haunted me for the rest of the day. By evening, I was pacing our living room, trying to make sense of Victoria's bizarre behavior. Our living room has always been my sanctuary. Warm hardwood floors, family photos covering the mantel, and Max's favorite spot right by the fireplace, where the late afternoon sun streams through the front windows. But now, even this peaceful space felt tainted by the morning's strange events. When my friend, Carol Peterson, arrived for our weekly coffee catch-up, I practically dragged her to the kitchen window before she'd even taken off her coat. Carol and I have been friends for over 15 years. We met when David was in elementary school and her daughter was in his class. She's one of those people who somehow manages to know everyone's business without being gossipy about it, if that makes sense. Carol works as a medical office manager, which has given her excellent skills in dealing with difficult people and reading situations quickly. "So, this has been happening every morning?" Carol asked, settling into one of our kitchen chairs with her usual no-nonsense attitude. "Like clockwork," I confirmed. 6:47 a.m., the clanging starts, Max barks, and then Victoria disappears back into her house. "That's oddly specific timing," Carol mused, her gray eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Almost like she's trying to establish a pattern." "A pattern for what?" Carol was quiet for a long moment, staring out at Victoria's perfectly maintained backyard. "Patricia, has she filed any complaints with the city about Max's barking?" The question hit me like ice water. I don't know. How would I find out?" "Well, if someone were building a case about a nuisance dog, they'd want documentation. Consistent times, repeated incidents, maybe even recordings of the barking." I felt my stomach drop. "You think she's trying to get Max in trouble?" "I think," Carol said carefully, "that your new neighbor might be more calculating than you realized." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Victoria's satisfied expression when Max started barking, the precise timing of her fence-banging routine, and Carol's unsettling theory about documentation. Around midnight, I found myself standing at our bedroom window, looking out at Victoria's house. Most of the windows were dark, but I could see the blue glow of a television or computer screen in what I assumed was her home office. The next morning, I was ready. I positioned myself at the kitchen window at 6:45 a.m. with my phone fully charged and set to record. David had agreed to stay in the living room with Max, ready to calm him down quickly if needed. At exactly 6:47 a.m., Victoria emerged from her back door carrying not just the metal spoon, but also what looked like a tablet or large phone. She walked to our shared fence line, started her rhythmic banging against the metal fence post, and the moment Max began barking, she held up her device, clearly recording his reaction. But what I discovered next changed everything. My breath caught in my throat as I watched Victoria hold up her recording device, but then I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. She wasn't just recording Max's barking. She was also checking her watch and speaking into the device, clearly documenting the time and circumstances. I fumbled with my own phone, making sure I was capturing everything. Victoria continued her methodical fence banging for exactly 2 more minutes, then abruptly stopped. Max's barking tapered off almost immediately, but Victoria kept recording for another 30 seconds before finally lowering her device and walking back toward her house with that same satisfied expression. "Did you get it?" David asked quietly as he appeared in the kitchen doorway, Max padding along beside him. "I got it," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "David, she was recording Max's reaction and narrating into her phone. Carol was right. She's building a case." David's jaw tightened. "What kind of case?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. Carol's name appeared on the screen. "Carol, you're not going to believe what I just recorded." "Patricia," Carol interrupted, her voice unusually tense. "I did some digging last night. I called my friend Janet, who works in the city clerk's office, and she owed me a favor. I had her check if there have been any noise complaints filed for your address. My stomach dropped. And 3 complaints in the past 2 weeks, all filed by Victoria Henderson, all documenting excessive barking between 6:45 and 7 a.m., all requesting animal control intervention. I sank into a kitchen chair. Animal control? Patricia, if she files 2 more complaints, the city will require you to attend a hearing, and if they determine Max is a nuisance animal? Carol's voice trailed off. What happens then? David asked, having caught enough of the conversation. I put the phone on speaker. Carol, David's here. What happens if they declare Max a nuisance? Carol sighed heavily. Best case scenario, you'd be required to keep him indoors or build a soundproof kennel. Worst case, if the complaints continue after that? She paused. They can order the animal to be removed from the premises. David's face went white. She's trying to get them to take Max away? It looks that way, Carol confirmed. But Patricia, you said you recorded her this morning? Yes, everything. Her banging on the fence, recording Max's reaction, the timing, all of it. Good. That's evidence of deliberate provocation. But we need to be smart about this. Has she done anything else unusual lately? I thought back over the past few days. Yesterday evening, when I was getting the mail, she made a point of walking over and commenting about how some dogs just aren't suited for suburban living. At the time, I thought she was just being unpleasant, but now... She's establishing a paper trail, Carol said grimly, making it seem like she's tried to address the issue directly with you before involving the authorities. David started pacing around the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. This is insane. Max barely barks except when she makes that noise. He's the most laid-back dog in the neighborhood. I know, honey, I said, reaching out to scratch Max's ears. He looked up at me with those trusting brown eyes, completely unaware that his entire future was being threatened. Carol, what do we do? First, you keep recording every incident. Document everything, times, what she does, how Max reacts, how long it lasts. Second, you need to start gathering evidence that Max isn't actually a problem dog. What kind of evidence? Character witnesses, I suppose. Other neighbors who can attest that Max doesn't normally bark excessively. Maybe ask your veterinarian to provide documentation about his temperament. David stopped pacing. Wait, wouldn't the other neighbors have heard all this barking she's complaining about? If Max was really as disruptive as she claims, surely someone else would have complained by now. That's a good point, Carol said. Patricia, have any of your other neighbors mentioned Max's barking? I thought about it. No, never. Mrs. Chen next door has never said anything, and she's home most mornings. The Johnsons across the street have always been friendly when we're walking Max. If he was disturbing the whole neighborhood at 6:47 every morning, someone would have mentioned it. Perfect. You should talk to them, get statements if possible. But Carol, I said, a new worry creeping into my voice. What if Victoria finds out we're onto her scheme? What if she escalates things? There was a long pause before Carol answered. That's what I'm worried about, actually. If she realizes you're building a counter case, she might try to file those remaining 2 complaints faster, or... Her voice trailed off ominously. Or what? David demanded. Carol's next words sent a chill through both of us. Or she might try something more direct to make sure Max is removed permanently. The silence that followed Carol's ominous words seemed to stretch endlessly in our small kitchen. I could hear the old refrigerator humming, the tick of the wall clock, and Max's gentle panting as he lay obliviously at our feet. The morning sunlight streaming through the gingham curtains felt suddenly harsh, illuminating the gravity of our situation in uncomfortable detail. What do you mean? Something more direct? My voice came out smaller than I intended, barely above a whisper. Carol shifted uncomfortably in her chair. her coffee cup forgotten as she clasped her hands together on the worn wooden table. Patricia, think about it. If Victoria is this calculating about creating fake noise complaints, what's to stop her from creating a situation where Max might actually pose a problem? David stopped his pacing abruptly, his face paling. Are you suggesting she might try to hurt him? Not necessarily hurt him, Carol said carefully, though her expression suggested she wasn't ruling it out entirely. But maybe provoke him into doing something that would give her grounds for a more serious complaint. Or... She paused, clearly reluctant to voice her next thought. Or what? I pressed, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Or she might try to create evidence of damage. Make it look like Max got loose and destroyed her property somehow. One incident like that, especially if she has photos and can claim she felt threatened, could bypass the whole 3-complaint process entirely. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications sank in. My hands found Max's warm fur, and I buried my fingers in his soft coat, as if I could somehow shield him from what was coming. He turned his gentle brown eyes up to me, sensing my distress, and gave my hand a reassuring lick. She wouldn't, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how naive they sounded. David's jaw clenched, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw real anger flash across his features. The hell she wouldn't. Patricia, this woman has been getting up at dawn to torment our dog just to build a case against him. You think property damage is beyond her? The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. I could feel panic rising in my chest, that familiar tightness that made it hard to breathe. But what can we do? We can't watch Max every second. We both have to work and... Hey! Carol reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her touch warm and steadying. We're not going to let that happen, but we need to be smart about this, and we need to move fast. David pulled out the chair next to me and sat down heavily, his earlier pacing energy deflated into grim determination. Okay, what's the plan? Carol straightened in her chair, and I could see her switching into what I privately called her crisis management mode. The same focused intensity she brought to organizing the annual neighborhood block party, or coordinating meal trains for families in need. First, we accelerate the evidence gathering. Patricia, I want you to talk to Mrs. Chen and the Johnsons today if possible. Don't make it seem urgent or suspicious, just casual conversations about Max. Maybe mention that you're worried he might be bothering people, and see what they say. I nodded, trying to focus on the concrete steps rather than the fear gnawing at my stomach. Second, we need to document Max's normal routine and behavior patterns. David, can you help with that? Times when he's outside, how he typically reacts to various stimuli, that sort of thing. Already on it, David said, pulling out his phone. I'm going to start a log. Times, activities, everything. Good. And third... Carol hesitated, her expression growing more serious. We need to consider installing some kind of security system. Something that covers your backyard and the property line with Victoria's house. The suggestion sent a chill through me. You really think it's going to come to that? I think, Carol said slowly, choosing her words carefully, that Victoria has already proven she's willing to go to considerable lengths to get rid of Max, and people like that, they don't usually stop until they get what they want, or until they're forced to stop. Max shifted at my feet, settling more heavily against my leg, as if sensing the tension in the room. I looked down at his trusting face, at the gray muzzle that showed his age, at the patient way he waited for whatever came next, and felt something harden in my chest. No, I said quietly, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. I'm not losing him. Not like this. Not because some bitter woman has decided to wage war on an innocent dog. David reached over and squeezed my shoulder. We won't let that happen. Carol nodded approvingly. That's the spirit we need. But Patricia, we have to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. If Victoria realizes we're building a defense, or if she gets impatient with the complaint process. She didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what she meant. The sound of deliberate footsteps on the sidewalk outside made us all freeze. Through the kitchen window, I could see Victoria walking slowly past our house, her head turned toward our yard with unmistakable interest. She wasn't just passing by. She was surveying, planning. Speak of the devil, David muttered under his breath. Victoria paused directly in front of our gate, pulling out her phone. For a moment, I thought she was going to take pictures of our property, but then I realized she was making a call. I can't hear what she's saying, I whispered, as if she might somehow hear me through the closed window. Carol moved quietly to the window, staying just out of sight behind the curtain. After a few minutes, Victoria ended her call and continued down the street, but not before casting one more calculating look at our house. Well, Carol said grimly as she returned to the table. I think we just witnessed the escalation we were worried about. The house felt different after Victoria's obvious surveillance walk. Even with the afternoon sun streaming through the kitchen windows, there was a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there an hour ago. I found myself second-guessing every sound. Was that Max's collar jingling too loudly? Would the scrape of David's chair against the floor somehow be added to Victoria's growing list of grievances? We can't live like this, I said, breaking the silence that had settled over us since Victoria disappeared from view. I'm already censoring myself in my own home. Carol leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming thoughtfully against her coffee mug. That's exactly what she wants. She's counting on you becoming so stressed, so paranoid about every little noise, that you'll decide it's easier to just get rid of Max. The thought made my stomach clench. Max had been with us for 7 years, since he was barely 2 years old. He'd seen us through David's job loss, through my mother's death, through countless ordinary days that were made better simply by his steady, loving presence. The idea of surrendering him to some shelter because a neighbor wanted to play power games felt like betrayal of the worst kind. David had been quiet since Victoria's phone call, staring out the window with an expression I recognized. It was the same look he got when he was working through a particularly complex problem at his job. Finally, he turned back to us. I've been thinking about what Carol said, about the security system. But there's something else we should consider first. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. What if we try talking to her? Not confrontationally, but just neighbor to neighbor. I felt my eyebrows shoot up. David, she deliberately tormented our dog for an hour yesterday just so she could call the cops on us. I don't think she's interested in reasonable conversation. I know how it sounds, he said, holding up his hands. But think about it. Right now, we're strangers to each other. She sees us as the people with the annoying dog. We see her as the crazy neighbor who hates Max. But what if there's something else going on? What if she's dealing with something we don't know about? Carol's expression was skeptical. Like what? I don't know. Maybe she works night shifts and really does need to sleep during the day. Maybe she has anxiety issues and noise genuinely affects her more than it would other people. Maybe she's grieving something and Max's barking is hitting her wrong, because she's already on edge. The suggestion hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to dismiss it outright. After what I'd witnessed yesterday, it was hard to imagine Victoria as anything other than a calculating antagonist. But David had always been better at seeing multiple sides of situations, and his perspective had saved us from making hasty decisions before. "Even if you're right," I said slowly, "even if she has legitimate reasons for being bothered by noise, that doesn't excuse the way she handled it. She could have come over and talked to us before involving the authorities." "You're absolutely right," David agreed. "But maybe it's not too late for us to be the bigger people here." Max chose that moment to lift his head and let out a soft woof, as if something in the backyard had caught his attention. All three of us froze, listening. After a moment, he settled back down, but the brief spike of anxiety I'd felt was telling. I was already becoming hypersensitive to every sound my own dog made. Carol seemed to read my expression. "Patricia, you don't have to make this decision right now. But if you did want to try David's approach, I'd recommend doing it sooner rather than later. Once these situations get entrenched, they become much harder to resolve." I looked at Max, then at David's hopeful face, then at Carol's measured concern. The rational part of my brain knew that David's suggestion made sense. Diplomacy was always worth trying before warfare. But the protective part of my heart, the part that had watched Victoria deliberately upset my dog, wanted nothing to do with extending olive branches. "If I did this," I said carefully, "and I'm not saying I will, but if I did, would you come with me?" David's face lit up. "Of course. And if she's as unreasonable as I think she's going to be, we back away immediately and go straight to Carol's security camera plan." "Absolutely." Carol nodded approvingly. "That sounds like a reasonable compromise. But Patricia, if you're going to do this, I'd suggest doing it today. The longer you wait, the more time Victoria has to file additional complaints or escalate things in other ways." The thought of walking over to Victoria's house, of voluntarily putting myself in her crosshairs, made my palms sweat. But the alternative, living in a state of constant vigilance, always wondering when the next complaint would come, always second-guessing whether Max's normal dog behaviors would somehow be used against us, seemed worse. "Okay," I said, the word coming out more as a sigh than a statement. "Let's try it." David reached over and squeezed my hand. "We'll keep it simple. Just introduce ourselves properly, acknowledge that there's been some concern about noise, and see if we can work something out together. And if she slams the door in our faces, then at least we'll know we tried the decent approach first." Carol gathered up her coffee mug and started to stand. "I should probably head home and let you two prepare for this. But Patricia, call me afterwards, okay? I want to know how it goes." As she moved toward the door, I felt a spike of panic. Having Carol here, with her legal background and calm demeanor, had made everything feel more manageable. The thought of facing Victoria with just David for backup suddenly seemed inadequate. "Carol, wait!" I called out. She turned back, eyebrows raised. What if you stayed? Just until we get back? I know it's asking a lot, but..." Understanding flickered across her face. "Of course. Max and I will hold down the fort." The relief I felt was probably disproportionate, but knowing that Carol would be here, that Max would be safe and monitored while we were gone, made the prospect of confronting Victoria feel less daunting. David was already moving toward the front door. "No time like the present, right?" I took a deep breath and looked out the window toward Victoria's house. From this angle, I could see her front porch clearly, the neat arrangement of plants, the small bench positioned to have a perfect view of our property. Had she been watching us from there? Planning her strategy while we went about our innocent daily routines? Right, I said, though my voice sounded far more confident than I felt. As we stepped outside, I noticed Victoria's car in her driveway and felt my heartbeat quicken. She was definitely home. There would be no postponing this conversation, no excuses to back out. We were halfway across the street when I saw her front curtain twitch. By the time we reached her front gate, the curtain was still again, but I knew she'd seen us coming. David reached for the gate latch just as Victoria's front door swung open, revealing her silhouette in the doorway. Even from a distance, I could see the rigid set of her shoulders, the defensive posture that suggested this conversation wasn't going to go the way David hoped. "Can I help you?" Victoria called out, her voice carrying clearly across her small front yard. The tone was polite enough, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach drop. This was either going to solve everything or make it infinitely worse. David stepped through the gate first, and I followed, my palms already starting to sweat despite the cool morning air. Victoria remained in her doorway, not moving to meet us halfway, or showing any of the neighborly warmth I remembered from when she'd first moved in. "Hi, Victoria," David said, his voice carrying that forced cheerfulness people use when they're trying too hard. "We were hoping we could have a quick chat with you about the dogs." "The dogs?" Victoria's eyebrows rose, and she stepped fully onto her porch, crossing her arms. "You mean the constant barking that's been disrupting my peace for weeks?" I felt my jaw clench at her phrasing, but David held up a placating hand. "Well, that's actually what we wanted to talk about. Patricia's been really concerned about Max bothering you, and we're hoping we can work together to find a solution." Victoria's gaze shifted to me, and I saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe? As if she hadn't expected us to acknowledge the barking at all. "I've been documenting every incident," she said carefully. "The times, the duration, the decibel level when possible." "Decibel level?" I couldn't help myself. "Victoria, you're measuring how loud my dog barks?" "I have a right to peaceful enjoyment of my property, Patricia. When a dog barks for 20 minutes straight at 7 in the morning, that affects my quality of life." David stepped slightly between us, sensing the rising tension. "Of course you do. That's completely reasonable. Patricia's been trying to figure out what's setting Max off so she can address it." "What's setting him off?" Victoria's voice went up a notch. "He's a poorly trained dog with irresponsible owners. That's what's setting him off." The words hit me like a slap. "Excuse me?" "Victoria?" David tried again. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here." "No misunderstanding." Victoria cut him off, her polite mask finally slipping. "I've lived next to responsible pet owners before. Their dogs don't bark every time someone walks by, or a car door closes, or the wind blows the wrong way." "Max doesn't bark at everything," I protested, feeling my face flush. "He's actually very well behaved most of the time. But lately something's been agitating him and I'm trying to—" "Agitating him?" Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe what's agitating him is that he's never been properly socialized or trained. Maybe it's that his owner lets him run wild in the backyard without any supervision or boundaries." My temper, which I'd been struggling to keep in check, finally snapped. "I supervise Max constantly. I've spent thousands of dollars on training, on a proper fence, on making sure he's well cared for. And for your information, the sudden barking started right around the time you moved in." Victoria's face went very still. "Are you suggesting this is somehow my fault?" "I'm saying the timing is interesting," I shot back, ignoring David's warning look. "Patricia," David murmured, "maybe we should—" "No, David, I want to hear this," Victoria said, her voice dangerously quiet. I want to hear Patricia explain how my mere presence in my own home is causing her dog to misbehave. I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to cross a line, but unable to stop myself. It's not your presence, Victoria. It's your behavior. The deliberate noise-making at 6 in the morning, the way you stand at your fence and stare at Max when he's outside. The deliberate noise-making? Victoria's voice rose to nearly a shout. I'm not allowed to take out my trash. I can't close my car door in my own driveway without it being some conspiracy against your precious dog. At 6 a.m. on a Saturday, when you know it will set him off? I was fully committed now, all of Carol's advice about staying calm forgotten. Come on, Victoria. You're not stupid, and neither am I. David put his hand on my arm. Patricia, let's take a step back here. But Victoria was already responding, her face flushed with anger. This is exactly what I expected. Instead of taking responsibility for your poorly trained animal, you're creating some paranoid fantasy where I'm the villain. This is classic narcissistic behavior, Patricia. Narcissistic? The word came out as a strangled laugh. You're calling me narcissistic? You're the one who moved into a neighborhood with dogs and then acts surprised when dogs make noise? There's a difference between normal dog behavior and constant disruption. Victoria snapped back. But clearly you're too self-absorbed to understand that difference. David stepped forward, his diplomatic demeanor finally cracking. Okay, I think we all need to cool down here. Victoria, I understand you're frustrated, but attacking Patricia's character isn't going to solve anything. Victoria's gaze shifted to David, and her expression became calculating. And you're what, exactly? The cavalry? Patricia can't fight her own battles, so she brings backup? I'm her brother, David said evenly, and I'm trying to help two reasonable adults find a reasonable solution. Reasonable adults? Victoria let out a bitter laugh. David, your sister just accused me of deliberately trying to make her dog bark so I can file complaints against her. Does that sound reasonable to you? The way she phrased it made my accusation sound insane, even to my own ears. I felt a flutter of doubt, the same doubt that had been plaguing me for weeks. Was I being paranoid? Was I so stressed about Max's behavior that I was imagining malicious intent where none existed? But then I remembered the smug satisfaction in Victoria's voice when she'd mentioned filing complaints to Carol. The way she'd stood at her fence yesterday, watching Max with that calculating expression. I know what I've seen, I said quietly, but with conviction. Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. The anger was still there, but underneath it, I caught a glimpse of something else. Something that looked almost like, you know what, Patricia? Victoria's voice had gone dangerously soft. You're right. You absolutely are. David and I both went very still. Victoria smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen on a neighbor's face. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. For a moment, I wondered if I'd heard her correctly. The world seemed to tilt sideways, and I found myself gripping David's arm without realizing it. What did you just say? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Victoria's smile widened, and there was no warmth in it whatsoever. I said you're absolutely right, Patricia. You know exactly what you've seen because you've been seeing it correctly this entire time. David's body had gone rigid beside me. Victoria, what are you talking about? Oh, come on, Victoria said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that made my skin crawl. Did you really think I was going to keep pretending? Patricia figured it out anyway. She's been watching me just as much as I've been watching that dog of hers. My mind was reeling. Part of me felt vindicated. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I had been right all along. But a much larger part of me was simply horrified. It was one thing to suspect your neighbor was deliberately antagonizing your dog. It was another thing entirely to have them admit it to your face with that terrible, satisfied smile. But why? The question burst out of me before I could stop it. Why would you do that? Victoria shrugged, as if we were discussing the weather. Because I wanted that dog gone, obviously, and the best way to get rid of a problem dog is to document that it's a problem dog. Max isn't a problem dog, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He's a good dog. The only reason he was barking was because you were deliberately... Exactly. Victoria's interruption was sharp and pleased. He was barking because I made him bark, and every time he barked, I had more evidence that you can't control your pet. David stepped forward, and I could see the anger building in his face. Do you have any idea how twisted that is? You've been torturing Patricia for weeks with this sick game. Torturing? Victoria laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. I've been solving a problem. I moved here for peace and quiet, and instead, I got stuck next to a woman with a barking dog. Traditional approaches clearly weren't going to work. Patricia's too attached to that animal to see reason. So, I created a situation where the authorities would have to step in. The casual cruelty in her voice made me feel physically sick. This wasn't just about noise complaints or property values. This was about control, about manipulation, about someone who saw other people as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to coexist with. You're insane, I breathed. I'm practical, Victoria corrected, and I'm very good at getting what I want. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully, and what I saw there made my stomach drop. This wasn't someone who had snapped under pressure or let frustration get the better of them. This was someone who had planned this, who had enjoyed this, who had no remorse whatsoever about what they had put me through. The complaints to Carol, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. You were building a case. Of course I was building a case. Documentation is everything, Patricia. Dates, times, duration of barking incidents. I have a very thorough record. David's hands had curled into fists at his sides. You manipulated an innocent animal to create fake evidence against Patricia. Do you understand how completely messed up that is? The barking wasn't fake, Victoria pointed out with infuriating logic. The dog actually barked. I just gave him reasons to bark. By doing what, exactly? I demanded. My fear was being rapidly overtaken by fury. What did you do to him? Victoria tilted her head, considering how much to reveal. Nothing harmful. I'm not a monster, Patricia. I just learned what gets his attention. Certain sounds, movements near the fence line, strategic timing when he's already alert. It really wasn't difficult. The methodical nature of it made me feel sick all over again. She had studied Max, learned his triggers, and used that knowledge against him, and against me. You've been watching us, I said, the full scope of the violation hitting me. You've been watching our routines, our schedules, learning when to maximize impact? Yes. Victoria's expression was almost proud. I told you I'm very good at getting what I want. But then something flickered across her face, just for an instant. Something that looked almost like uncertainty. Victoria, David said, his voice deadly quiet. What exactly is it that you want? The question seemed to catch her off guard, and for the first time since this nightmare conversation had started, she hesitated. And in that hesitation, I realized we might have just stumbled onto something much bigger than noise complaints. The silence stretched between us, and I watched Victoria's composed mask begin to crack around the edges. Her fingers drummed against her crossed arms. A nervous tick that seemed completely at odds with the calculating woman who had just confessed to orchestrating weeks of psychological warfare against my dog. "Victoria?" David pressed again. "What is it that you actually want?" "I want," she started, then stopped. Her gaze darted between David and me, then toward Max, who had settled into a watchful position by my feet. "I want things to be quiet." "Bullshit," I said flatly. The profanity felt good, liberating even. "If you wanted quiet, you would have talked to me like a normal human being. You wanted me gone." "Yes," she admitted, but there was something hollow in her voice now. "Yes, I wanted you gone." "Why?" David asked. "Patricia's been a good neighbor. She keeps her property neat. She's never had parties, never caused problems." "Until the dog," Victoria interrupted, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own words anymore. "The dog you deliberately provoked," I reminded her. "So why, Victoria? What did I ever do to you?" She was quiet for so long, I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller somehow, less controlled. "You replaced them." "Replaced who?" "The Hendersons, Harold and Dorothy Henderson. They lived in your house for 37 years. Victoria's eyes had gone distant, unfocused. "Dorothy and we had coffee every Tuesday morning. Harold helped me with my garden. When Dorothy got sick, I drove her to her appointments." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I glanced at David, who looked equally stunned. "They were your friends," I said softly. "They were my family," Victoria corrected, her voice cracking slightly. "I never married, never had children. The Hendersons they were all I had." "Victoria?" David said gently. "When did they move?" 14 months ago. Dorothy needed full-time care, and Harold couldn't manage on his own anymore. Their son moved them to some assisted living place in Phoenix." Her laugh was bitter. "Closer to family," he said, "as if I wasn't family." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. "So, when I moved in, you weren't them," Victoria said simply. "You were young and busy, and you had that ridiculous dog, and you didn't wave when you saw me in the yard. Dorothy always waved." "You never waved either," I pointed out, but without heat. "You glared at me from day one." "Because you weren't supposed to be there." The words burst out of her with sudden vehemence. "That was their house, their garden, their life, and you just took it over like they never existed." David ran a hand through his hair. "Victoria, that's not how selling houses works. The Hendersons chose to move. Patricia didn't steal anything from them." "I know that," Victoria snapped, but her anger seemed directed more at herself than at us. "I'm not stupid, David. I know they had to go. I know Patricia had every right to buy the house. I know none of this is logical." "But you did it anyway," I said. "I did it anyway." She met my eyes directly for the first time since this conversation had started. "I wanted you to be miserable enough to leave. I wanted the house to be empty rather than have strangers living in it. I wanted—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "You wanted your grief to have somewhere to go," David said quietly. Victoria's face crumpled slightly at his words, and for a moment she looked less like a calculating neighbor from hell and more like a lonely old woman who had lost the only people who mattered to her. But then I thought about the weeks of anxiety, the sleepless nights, the constant worry about losing Max, and my sympathy curdled back into anger. "I understand that you're grieving," I said carefully, "and I'm sorry for your loss. But Victoria, what you've put me through, what you've put Max through. It's not okay. It's not justified by your pain. I know, she whispered. Do you? I challenged. Because knowing something and actually understanding it are two different things. You made me think I was going crazy. You made me doubt myself, doubt Max. You had me convinced I was a terrible pet owner who couldn't control her dog. Patricia, I'm not finished. My voice was shaking now, all the suppressed fear and anger of the past weeks pouring out. You manipulated Carol into thinking I was a problem tenant. You created a paper trail designed to get me evicted. You studied my dog like he was some kind of lab experiment so you could torture him more effectively. I never hurt him. You hurt him every time you deliberately triggered his protective instincts. I was shouting now, and Max whined softly at my feet. I forced myself to lower my voice. You hurt both of us, Victoria. Systematically, methodically, and the worst part is, if David hadn't figured out what you were doing, you would have kept going until you succeeded. Victoria was crying now, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry. Are you? Or are you just sorry you got caught? That question hung in the air between us, and I realized that her answer, her real, honest answer, would determine everything that happened next. But before she could respond, Carol's voice cut through the tension from somewhere behind me. Well, she said dryly, this explains a lot. I turned around to find Carol standing in Victoria's doorway, holding what looked like a thick manila folder. Her expression was a mixture of embarrassment and barely contained anger, though I couldn't tell if that anger was directed at Victoria, at me, or at herself. How long have you been standing there? I asked, my heart still racing from my confrontation with Victoria. Long enough, Carol said grimly. She stepped fully outside, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. The sound echoed off the narrow walls of the apartment hallway, and I noticed how the fluorescent lighting overhead cast harsh shadows under everyone's eyes, making us all look older and more worn than we were. Victoria wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her pale skin. Carol, I can explain. Can you? Carol's voice was sharp, professional in a way that made my stomach clench. This was the voice of a property manager who'd discovered a serious problem. Because I've been going through the complaint file you've been building, Victoria. Every single incident, every timestamp, every photograph. She hefted the folder slightly. Very thorough work. David shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. Max pressed closer to my legs, sensing the change in atmosphere. The hallway felt smaller suddenly, too cramped for 4 people, and the weight of everything that had been said and done. I was just doing my job as a tenant, Victoria said weakly, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. Carol let out a short, bitter laugh. Your job as a tenant? Victoria, you filed 14 complaints in 3 weeks. 14. Do you know how many noise complaints I've received about other units in this building in the past year? 3. Total. I felt a chill run down my spine. 14 complaints. I'd only known about a handful of them. But more interesting than the quantity, Carol continued, her voice growing colder, is the quality of your documentation, the precision, the way you noted exact times, exact durations, the way you managed to photograph and record incidents that, according to Patricia here, were triggered by your own actions. Victoria's face went white. You don't understand the situation. I understand it perfectly now. Carol cut her off. What I don't understand is why I didn't see it sooner. She turned to me, and I saw genuine regret in her eyes. Patricia, I owe you an enormous apology. The way I spoke to you, the things I threatened, I should have investigated more thoroughly before jumping to conclusions. You couldn't have known, I said, though part of me was still angry at how quickly she'd been willing to believe I was the problem. I could have and should have, Carol insisted. It's literally my job to investigate complaints properly, not just accept them at face value. She glanced back at Victoria, whose shoulders had begun to shake. Especially when they come with this level of, shall we call it creative documentation? David cleared his throat. What happens now? The question hung in the air like smoke. I realized I'd been so focused on proving my innocence that I hadn't really thought about what would come next. What did happen when you caught someone systematically lying to create problems for their neighbors? Carol's jaw tightened. Now I have to figure out how to handle a tenant who has deliberately filed false complaints and potentially violated multiple terms of her lease agreement. False complaints? Victoria's voice cracked. The dog was barking. Because you made him bark, I said, my anger flaring again. You admitted it, Victoria. You stood right here and admitted that you deliberately triggered him so you could file complaints. That's... Victoria looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist in the narrow hallway. That's not how I meant it to sound. How did you mean it to sound? David asked quietly. His calm tone was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been shouting. Because it sounded like you confessed to harassment. The word harassment seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. She actually staggered back a step, her hand reaching for the wall to steady herself. I didn't mean... She looked at each of us in turn, her eyes wide and frightened. I just wanted things to go back to how they were. But they can't, Carol said, not unkindly but with finality. Victoria, you know they can't, and what you've done to try to force it, this isn't grief anymore. This is something else entirely. Max whined softly, and I realized my hands were clenched so tightly, my nails were digging into my palms. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was starting to ebb, leaving me feeling shaky and strange. So what happens now? I asked, echoing David's earlier question. Carol's expression was grim as she hefted the folder again. Now I have to decide whether this is something we can resolve with a conversation and some very clear boundaries, or whether this is something that requires more serious intervention. What kind of intervention? Victoria whispered. But before Carol could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell, growing louder as they approached our floor. Heavy, purposeful steps that made all four of us freeze. Were you expecting someone? Carol asked Victoria, but Victoria just shook her head, her face going even paler. The footsteps stopped right outside the stairwell door, and we could hear the jangle of keys. Someone was about to join our little confrontation, and something about the deliberate way they'd climbed the stairs suggested this wasn't going to be a casual encounter. The keys jingled again, and then the stairwell door swung open with a heavy creak that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited to see who would emerge, but when the door fully opened, I felt my knees nearly buckle with relief. It was David. For a moment, none of us moved or spoke. David stood in the doorway, his hand still on the door handle, taking in the scene before him. Carol, with her thick folder of complaints, Victoria pressed against her apartment door, looking like a cornered animal, and me standing there with Max at my side, probably looking as shell-shocked as I felt. I heard voices in the hallway, David said slowly, his eyes moving from face to face. Loud voices. I was coming up from the laundry room and He stepped fully into the hallway, letting the door swing shut behind him with a soft thud. "What's going on?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see Victoria's chest rising and falling rapidly, her breathing shallow and quick. She looked like she might bolt back into her apartment at any second, but Carol's presence seemed to pin her in place. "We were just having a discussion about the noise complaints," Carol said carefully, her professional mask sliding back into place. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held the folder just a little too tightly. David's gaze settled on Victoria, and I watched something shift in his expression. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of weary recognition that made my stomach clench. "The complaints," he repeated, his voice flat. "About Max." Victoria flinched at the sound of the dog's name, and Max's ears perked up at hearing it. He looked around at all of us with that innocent, trusting expression that dogs get when they know something is happening, but can't quite figure out what. "David," I started, but he held up a hand. "No, let me guess," he said, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "There have been multiple complaints, very detailed complaints, about barking that happens at very specific times." His voice was getting quieter with each word, which somehow made it more unsettling. "Barking that always seems to happen when I'm not around to witness it?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The color had drained from her face completely now, leaving her looking almost gray under the harsh hallway lighting. "David," Carol began, but he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "And I bet these complaints started right after we moved in. Right after Victoria realized that the quiet apartment next door wasn't going to stay quiet anymore." He took a step closer, and Victoria actually pressed herself flatter against her door. "How close am I getting, Victoria?" The use of her name seemed to break whatever spell had been holding Victoria frozen. She straightened up, some of the defiance flickering back into her eyes. "Your dog barks," she said, but her voice was shaky. "He barks constantly. He's disrupted my entire life." "No," David said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made me shiver. "No, Victoria, that's not what happened. What happened is that you decided you didn't want neighbors. And when you couldn't make us disappear by wishing, you decided to make us disappear by force." The word force seemed to echo in the narrow hallway. Carol shifted uncomfortably, the papers in her folder rustling. "The complaints are very detailed," Carol said finally. "Very specific about times and duration of barking incidents." "I'm sure they are," David replied. "Victoria always was thorough. Even when we were kids, if she wanted to get someone in trouble, she'd have her story straight down to the minute." Victoria's eyes widened. "That's not... You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" David's voice was getting quieter still, but there was something dangerous in it now. "You think I don't remember how you used to handle it when things didn't go your way? The elaborate stories you'd tell Mom when you wanted me to get in trouble? The way you'd set up situations so that I'd look guilty when she walked in?" I felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion. The air in the hallway seemed to be getting thicker, harder to breathe. "This is different," Victoria whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. "Is it?" David asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly the same. You want something. You want us gone. So you're manufacturing a crisis to get what you want." Carol cleared her throat. "David, I think..." "Carol," he said, turning to face her directly. "How many of these complaints did you witness personally?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Carol's professional composure cracked slightly. "Well, property managers don't typically witness every complaint firsthand. We rely on tenant reports." "How many?" David pressed. Carol's jaw tightened. None, but multiple complaints from a reliable tenant. Reliable, David repeated. Victoria, tell Carol about the time you convinced Mom that I'd broken her favorite vase. Remember that? How you spent 2 weeks moving it a little bit each day, making it wobble more and more, until it finally fell while I was in the room? Victoria's face went white again. Stop it. Or the time you told the school counselor I was bullying you, and you had all these detailed stories about things I'd supposedly said and done. Remember how long that investigation took? How many people got dragged into it before they figured out? Stop it! Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. This isn't about that. This isn't about when we were kids. But the damage was done. I could see it in Carol's face, the way her expression shifted from professional concern to something harder, more skeptical. The folder in her hands suddenly looked less like evidence and more like props in an elaborate performance. The hallway fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the sound of all of us breathing. Max whined softly and pressed closer to my leg, sensing the tension even if he couldn't understand it. Finally, Carol spoke. Victoria, she said, and her voice had changed completely. Gone was the careful neutrality of property management speak. Now she sounded tired and disappointed. We need to talk. Victoria's shoulders sagged as if invisible strings holding her upright had suddenly been cut. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in the harsh, fluorescent light of the hallway. The carefully constructed facade she'd been maintaining seemed to crumble in real time. Carol, I can explain. She started, but Carol held up a hand. No, Carol said, and I'd never heard her voice so firm. I think I'm starting to understand what's been happening here. She looked down at the folder in her hands, then back up at Victoria with something that might have been pity. The timing of these complaints, the specificity of some of the details you provided, things that seemed almost too convenient. I felt David's hand squeeze my shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Max had stopped whining and was sitting pressed against my legs, as if he could sense that the immediate danger had passed. Victoria's eyes darted between Carol and David, then landed on me. For a moment, I saw something raw and vulnerable there, a flash of the little girl she'd once been, scared and desperate for attention. But then it was gone, replaced by the bitter defensiveness I'd grown so familiar with. You don't understand, she said to Carol, her voice barely above a whisper. Living next to that noise every day, it's unbearable. Victoria, David said gently, and I was surprised by the compassion in his voice. Max barks maybe twice a week, and never for more than a few minutes. You know that. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could hear my own heartbeat, the soft whoosh of the building's ventilation system, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Normal sounds of life continuing around us while our small drama played out in this sterile hallway. Carol closed the folder with a decisive snap. I'm going to need to review these complaints more carefully, she said. And I think we need to have a different kind of conversation, Victoria, about tenant responsibilities and truthfulness in reporting. Victoria's face flushed red. You can't just dismiss my concerns because of some ancient history between me and my brother. I'm not dismissing anything, Carol replied evenly. I'm reassessing the situation based on new information. There's a difference. I watched Victoria struggle with this, saw the moment when she realized that her carefully laid plans were unraveling. The complaints, the documentation, the official process she'd been so proud of, all of it suddenly looked different under this new light. The dog still barks, she said stubbornly, but there was no fire left in her voice. All dogs bark sometimes, I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken directly to her since this whole confrontation began. Max is actually pretty quiet for a dog. Most of our neighbors have never even met him because he's so calm. Victoria looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in her expression. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Exhaustion maybe, or loneliness. Carol tucked the folder under her arm. I think this conversation needs to continue privately, she said, looking meaningfully at Victoria. Let's go to my office. As they turned to leave, David called after them. Carol, will there be any follow-up about this? Carol paused, considering. I'll be reviewing all the complaints and the building's policy on documentation requirements. We take false reporting very seriously. Victoria flinched at those words, but she didn't protest. She followed Carol down the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls until they disappeared around the corner toward the elevator. David and I stood there in the sudden quiet, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like dust after an explosion. Are you okay? He asked. I looked down at Max, who was looking up at me with those trusting brown eyes, tail wagging tentatively as if asking if everything was all right now. I reached down and scratched behind his ears. I think so, I said. David, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. He shook his head. Victoria's been doing stuff like this her whole life. I should have recognized the pattern sooner, should have said something before it got this far. You couldn't have known, I said, and honestly, I'm not sure I would have believed you if you'd tried to warn me. It would have sounded too crazy? David supplied with a wry smile. Complicated, I corrected. Family stuff always is. We walked back toward my apartment, Max trotting happily between us. The familiar hallway looked the same as it had an hour ago, but everything felt different now. The threat that had been hanging over us for weeks was gone, dissolved by truth and the simple act of someone standing up for what was right. Do you think she'll be okay? I asked as we reached my door. Victoria, I mean. David was quiet for a moment, considering. She'll face some consequences for the false complaints, probably. But maybe that's what she needs. Maybe having to deal with the real results of her actions will help her understand why she keeps doing this. I hoped he was right. Despite everything Victoria had put me through, I didn't want to see her genuinely hurt. I just wanted her to stop trying to hurt others. What made you come up here today? I asked. Was it just coincidence? I saw Carol in the lobby with that official-looking folder, he admitted. And I had a feeling. Victoria's been different lately. More agitated. I was worried she might be escalating whatever she was doing. Brother's intuition? I suggested. Something like that. He paused at my door. Listen, I know this whole thing has been stressful. If you need anything, or if there are any more problems, I'll call you, I promised. After he left, I sat on my couch with Max curled up beside me, processing everything that had happened. The apartment felt peaceful in a way it hadn't for weeks. No longer did every sound from the hallway make me tense up, wondering if it was Victoria setting up another complaint. No longer did I have to worry about Max's normal dog behaviors getting us evicted. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Carol just called. Victoria admitted to the false complaints. She's going to face some penalties, but Carol thinks it can be resolved without legal action if she agrees to some conditions. I texted back, what kind of conditions? Anger management counseling, and she has to cover any costs related to the false reporting. Also can't file any more noise complaints for 6 months unless she can provide independent verification. It seemed fair, and more than that, it seemed like it might actually help Victoria deal with whatever was driving her to these elaborate schemes. As the sun set outside my windows, painting the apartment in warm golden light, I reflected on how the whole situation had resolved. It hadn't been lawyers or building management or some complex legal process that saved us. It had been family, David's willingness to speak up about patterns he recognized, his courage to confront a difficult truth about someone he loved. Max stretched and yawned, then settled his head on my lap with a contented sigh. Tomorrow, I realized, we could go back to our normal routine. Morning walks without worry, evening playtime without fear of complaints. Just a regular dog and his owner, living their quiet life. Sometimes the most elaborate problems have the simplest solutions. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to tell the truth.